Welcome to Buried Files. Tonight you will hear 7 of the most disturbing true accounts ever reported from the remote valleys and deep forests of Appalachia, where whispers of feral outsiders and vanished travelers have rattled locals for generations. The stories you are about to experience have not been sensationalized or altered for effect. Every detail comes from eyewitnesses, ex-law enforcement, and those who have risked their reputations to share truths that most would rather ignore. Our team spent months verifying facts, comparing reports, and consulting regional experts to ensure that authenticity is never sacrificed for fear. These stories are not meant to entertain. They exist to warn, to inform, and perhaps to explain what has haunted the Appalachian wilds for centuries. If you want real horror grounded in documented evidence, subscribe to Buried Files. Hit the notification bell so you do not miss our upcoming investigations, and add your testimony in the comments if you have encountered the inexplicable yourself. Now prepare yourself as we reveal the cases that made even the most skeptical investigators question what is truly possible in America's oldest mountains. 15 years shooting wilderness photography across the Appalachians taught me to trust my instincts about light, composition, and when something in the frame does not belong. I made a career out of documenting the forgotten corners of these mountains, the abandoned homesteads where families once carved out lives in impossible terrain, the old logging roads that nature was slowly reclaiming, the hidden waterfalls that only locals knew existed. My work had been published in outdoor magazines, featured in gallery shows across 3 states, and I prided myself on capturing images that told stories most people would never witness firsthand. That confidence, that sense of mastery over my craft, shattered completely during a 3-week assignment along the Tennessee-North Carolina border in October of last year. The project seemed straightforward enough when the Historical Preservation Society contacted me. They wanted comprehensive documentation of pre-Civil War settlements scattered throughout the Nantahala National Forest, structures that were degrading rapidly and might not survive another harsh winter. The pay was decent, the timeline was flexible, and I would have unlimited access to areas that were technically off-limits to regular hikers. I packed my gear, loaded up my truck with enough supplies for extended backcountry stays, and headed into the mountains with the kind of excitement that always accompanied a new project. The first week went exactly as planned. I located and photographed 11 different sites, ranging from single-room cabins to the remains of what had once been a small mill operation. The weather cooperated, the light was perfect, and I was getting shots that exceeded my expectations. It was on day 9 when I first noticed something wrong, though at the time I dismissed it as a technical glitch. I had spent the morning photographing the ruins of a stone chimney that stood alone in a clearing, the rest of the structure having rotted away decades earlier. When I reviewed my images that evening at my campsite, one photo showed what looked like a person standing approximately 30 yards behind the chimney, partially obscured by a stand of laurel bushes. The figure appeared to be extremely thin, almost skeletal, wearing what might have been torn clothing or possibly nothing at all. The image quality made it difficult to determine exact details. But what bothered me most was that I had absolutely no memory of seeing anyone in that clearing. I had been alone for hours, working methodically through different angles and lighting conditions, and I was certain no one had approached. I convinced myself it must have been a trick of shadows and foliage, the way branches and undergrowth can sometimes create pareidolia patterns that the brain interprets as human forms. Photographers see these false positives all the time, especially in heavily wooded environments where light filters through multiple layers of vegetation. I made a note in my log about the anomaly and moved on to the next location on my list. 2 days later, I photographed an abandoned schoolhouse about 8 miles from the chimney site. A beautiful structure with most of its roof still intact and windows that framed the forest beyond like living paintings. That night, in reviewing my files, I found the figure again. This time, it was visible through one of the schoolhouse windows, standing inside the building in a room I had thoroughly explored and documented. The figure was in the exact same pose as the first photograph, arms hanging at its sides, head tilted at an unnatural angle, and that same emaciated appearance that made my skin prickle with unease. I went back through every image from that location, frame by frame, examining the timestamps. The figure appeared in exactly one shot, taken at 3:47 in the afternoon while I was outside the building shooting exterior details. I had been inside that schoolhouse for more than an hour before that photograph, and I had returned inside for another 30 minutes afterward. The building was small, only 3 rooms total, with nowhere for someone to hide without being immediately visible. More troubling was the realization that the figure was standing in a position that would have required it to be perfectly still for the entire duration of my visit, because any movement would have been audible on those old wooden floors. I tried to rationalize it as someone playing a prank, perhaps a local who knew my schedule and was deliberately trying to unnerve me. But that explanation felt wrong. The remoteness of these locations, the physical exertion required to reach them, the sheer coincidence of timing, none of it added up to a coherent prank scenario. By the end of the second week, I had documented 23 sites, and the figure had appeared in 11 photographs. Never more than once per location, always in the background, always in that identical pose. I started examining my images immediately after taking them, sometimes within minutes, and the figure was always there in shots where I was absolutely certain I had been alone. I began photographing in rapid succession, taking multiple frames of the same composition within seconds of each other, thinking I might catch the figure moving or reveal some technical explanation for its presence. Instead, I discovered something worse. The figure was getting closer. In the earliest images, it had been 30 or 40 yards away, barely distinguishable. In more recent shots, the distance had decreased to maybe 15 yards, close enough that I could make out disturbing details. The skin appeared stretched too tight over the bones. The limbs were disproportionately long, and there was something wrong about the way it stood, like joints bending at angles that human anatomy should not allow. I stopped sleeping at the documented sites and started making camp several miles away from my shooting locations, though I questioned whether distance mattered. I set up my tent with obsessive attention to security, arranging my gear so I would hear if anything approached during the night, and I kept my headlamp within reach at all times. Sleep became difficult despite my exhaustion, and when I did manage to doze off, I had recurring dreams of standing in front of my camera, watching myself from a distance, unable to control my own movements. On day 19, I made a decision that I knew was irrational, but felt absolutely necessary. I would photograph myself. I set up my camera on a tripod at the ruins of a barn foundation, composed the shot to include both the ruins and the forest behind me, and used a remote trigger to take a series of self-portraits. When I reviewed the images, my hands started shaking so badly I nearly dropped the camera. The figure was there, standing less than 6 feet directly behind me, close enough that I should have felt its presence, close enough that its breath should have disturbed my hair. Its face was visible for the first time, and I wish to this day that it had remained hidden. The features were human in their basic structure, but wrong in every proportion. Eyes too large and set too wide. Mouth stretched into something that might have been a smile, but looked more like a grimace of pain or hunger. Skin pulled so tight that the skull was clearly visible beneath. What made it worse was realizing that while I had been standing there, triggering the camera every few seconds, I had heard absolutely nothing behind me. No breathing, no footsteps, no displacement of air or leaves. Complete silence despite something being close enough to touch me. I packed my equipment with shaking hands, abandoning half of my gear in my rush to get off that mountain. I drove straight through to my apartment, not stopping except for gas, unable to shake the feeling that something was following my truck despite the absurdity of that thought. When I finally felt safe enough to examine my memory cards comprehensively, downloading every image from the entire 3-week assignment, I discovered the true scope of what had been happening. The figure had not appeared in 11 photographs. It had appeared in 47, and I had simply missed most of them during my nightly reviews because I had not been looking carefully enough. When I arranged the images chronologically and viewed them in sequence, the progression was unmistakable. The figure had been systematically closing the distance between us, appearing first at the extreme edges of frames, then moving steadily closer with each location I visited. But the final discovery, the one that made me seriously consider destroying all of my equipment and never photographing anything again, came when I found images on my cards that I had not taken. They were mixed in with my legitimate shots, matching the metadata timestamps to moments when I was definitely not operating the camera. These unauthorized images showed views from inside my tent while I was sleeping, perspectives from the forest looking toward my campfire, and worst of all, close-up shots of my face taken from above while I was clearly unconscious. The file properties indicated they had been captured with my own camera using my standard settings, but the angles were impossible. Some were taken from positions 8 or 10 feet off the ground, others from ground level only inches away from my face, and several showed my tent from the outside at distances that would have required the camera to be 30 or 40 feet away, which was impossible because my camera had been inside the tent with me every night. I took the memory cards to a digital forensics specialist, a former colleague who worked in law enforcement, hoping he could explain the file corruption or security breach or whatever rational explanation might exist. He examined everything over the course of 2 days, running multiple analysis programs and consulting with other experts. When he called me back to his office, his expression told me he had not found any comforting answers. The files were authentic, not edited or manipulated in any way. The metadata was consistent and it showed no signs of tampering. The timestamps corresponded to the dates I had been in the mountains. Everything about the images was forensically sound, which meant either my camera had been operated by someone else while I slept, or something had accessed my equipment in ways that should have been impossible. The final image he showed me, the one he had isolated and enhanced, made me walk out of his office without saying goodbye. It was a photograph taken at 3:17 in the morning on my last night in the mountains, shot from inside my tent, looking down at me, sleeping in my bag. But the reflection visible in my camera's LCD screen, the screen that would have been facing the photographer, showed not a person holding the camera, but that same emaciated figure, holding my equipment in hands with too many joints, staring down at my unconscious form with those 2 large eyes. My colleague noted that the camera strap visible in the image showed distinctive marks, parallel grooves cut deep into the nylon material. And when I examined my actual camera strap, the marks were there, freshly carved, looking exactly like teeth marks, but not matching any known animal dentition pattern. I quit wilderness photography that week, sold most of my equipment at a significant loss, kept only a basic digital camera for everyday use, and took a job doing product photography for an online retailer. The work is boring and the pay is mediocre, but I am never alone, never more than 20 feet from other people. and I never have to spend a night in the woods questioning whether I am actually alone in my tent. The Historical Preservation Society kept asking when I would deliver the completed project, and eventually I sent them everything I had, images and all, with a note saying I would not be returning to finish the assignment. They never contacted me again, and I sometimes wonder if they saw the same things in those photographs that I did, or if the figure only shows itself to certain people under certain circumstances. 3 months after I left those mountains, I received a package at my apartment. No return address. Postmarked from a tiny post office in western North Carolina that serves an area with maybe 200 permanent residents. Inside was a USB drive containing a single photograph. The image showed me sitting at my kitchen table, the table I'm looking at right now as I tell this story. Taken from outside my third-floor apartment window, looking through the glass that should have been impossible to reach without a ladder or climbing equipment. I was alone in the photograph, but in the window's reflection, standing behind where I sat, was that familiar skeletal figure, closer than it had ever been before, almost close enough to rest its hands on my shoulders. The metadata showed the image had been captured 2 nights earlier at 11:43 p.m., which I remember clearly because I had been awake at that time, sitting in that exact chair, reviewing job applications for photography positions in other cities. I have not opened my curtains since then. I am considering moving somewhere with no windows, or at least somewhere with no view. I tell people I am transitioning away from photography because the market is oversaturated, because I want to try something new, because I need a change of pace. But the truth is simpler and more terrifying. I spent 15 years documenting the forgotten places of the Appalachian Mountains. And somewhere along the way, something that lives in those forgotten places decided to start documenting me. Every night, I wonder if that thing is still taking photographs, still building its collection of images, showing me sleeping, eating, working, living my life, getting closer with each shot, waiting for the right moment to stop documenting and start participating. Sometimes my phone camera activates by itself, the shutter sound going off in the middle of the night, and I refuse to look at what it might have captured. Some photographs are not meant to be developed, and some subjects are better left in the dark. You volunteer for search and rescue because you want to help, because you believe every lost person deserves to come home. But nobody tells you what to do when you find them and wish you had not. I joined the Pisgah National Forest Volunteer SAR team in the spring of 2019, motivated by the same idealism that drives most people to this work. I was 32, physically fit from years of trail running and backpacking, certified in wilderness first aid, and genuinely believed I could make a difference in my community. The training was intensive but manageable, covering everything from navigation and rope systems to psychological first aid for trauma victims. By my second year, I had participated in 14 successful rescues, mostly day hikers who had gotten turned around on unfamiliar trails or experienced minor injuries that prevented them from self-evacuating. The work was exhausting and often thankless. But every time we brought someone safely off that mountain, I felt like I had contributed something meaningful to the world. That sense of purpose died completely on a Saturday night in mid-October when we received a call about an 8-year-old boy named Tyler Morrison, who had wandered away from his family's campsite near the Davidson River area. The circumstances were straightforward, according to the initial report. The family had been cooking dinner around 6 p.m. when Tyler asked if he could explore the creek about 50 yards from their site. His parents had agreed, but told him to stay within sight and to come back before dark. When they called for him 20 minutes later, there was no response. and a search of the immediate area revealed no sign of the boy. By the time our team assembled at the ranger station, it was already past 9 p.m. Temperatures were dropping into the low 40s, and we had maybe 6 hours of darkness ahead of us before we could bring in the helicopter for aerial support. The incident commander divided us into 4 teams of 3, each assigned a different sector radiating out from the family campsite. My team consisted of myself, a retired firefighter named Marcus, and a college student named Jennifer who was on her 5th call-out. We drew the northeast sector, which included some of the densest laurel thickets in that part of the forest, the kind of terrain that swallows people whole and makes search patterns nearly impossible to execute properly. We moved methodically through our assigned area, calling Tyler's name every few minutes, listening for any response, marking our progress on GPS units that fed data back to the command post. The forest at night has its own particular quality of silence, a heaviness that seems to absorb sound rather than reflect it, and our voices felt small and ineffective against that vast darkness. Around 2 a.m., approximately 4 hours into our search, I heard something that made me stop mid-step. It was not Tyler's voice exactly, but rather a child's voice coming from somewhere deeper in the thicket, singing in a rhythmic pattern that sounded almost like a nursery rhyme, but with words I did not recognize. I signaled to Marcus and Jennifer, and we adjusted our bearing to move toward the sound, fighting through branches that seemed deliberately arranged to keep people out. The singing continued, never getting louder or quieter, maintaining the same unsettling cadence that made the hair on my arms stand up, despite the physical exertion of pushing through the undergrowth. When we finally broke through into a small clearing, I saw him sitting cross-legged on a flat rock, completely calm. Not a scratch on him despite having supposedly been lost in that brutal terrain for 8 hours. Tyler looked up when we entered the clearing, and his expression was not relief or fear or any of the emotions you would expect from a frightened child who had just been found. Instead, he smiled with an odd formality and said, "You came looking. They said you would come looking." His voice had a peculiar flatness to it, words enunciated with unnatural precision, like he was reciting lines from a script. Marcus immediately radioed our position to command, while Jennifer approached the boy slowly, speaking in the soft, reassuring tones we had been trained to use with traumatized children. She asked if he was hurt, if he was cold, if he knew where he was. And Tyler answered each question with perfect composure, explaining that he was fine, that he had found friends, that they had been teaching him songs. When Jennifer asked what friends he meant, Tyler gestured toward the darkness beyond our headlamp beams and said they were waiting just over there, that they wanted to meet us too, that they had been watching the volunteers all night and thought we seemed like good people. I felt my chest tighten with an unease I could not quite articulate. Marcus had his hand on his radio again, and I could see in his expression that he was feeling the same wrongness I was. We needed to get this child out of the woods immediately. But something in his demeanor, in the way he kept glancing toward the trees like he was receiving instructions from someone we could not see, made me hesitate to simply grab him and start moving. Tyler stood up from his rock with movements that seemed too deliberate, too controlled for an 8-year-old who had been lost in the cold for hours. And he said he wanted to show us where he had been staying before we took him back. He used that word specifically. Staying, not hiding or lost. And he spoke about the past 8 hours like they had been a pleasant visit rather than a traumatic ordeal. Against every protocol in our training manual, against every instinct that was screaming at me to get this child to the trailhead immediately, I found myself agreeing to follow him, justifying the decision by telling myself we needed to verify he had not left any gear or clothing that might provide evidence about what had happened. Tyler led us approximately 300 yards through the laurel in a direction that should have been impossible to navigate without a machete. Yet the branches seemed to part for him, creating a path that closed behind us as we moved deeper into terrain that was not on any of our maps. We emerged into another clearing, larger this time, where I saw what initially looked like a crude campsite, but revealed itself to be something far more disturbing upon closer examination. There were shelters constructed from woven branches and bark, arranged in a rough circle around a central fire pit that contained embers still glowing faintly. Hanging from trees were bundles of dried herbs, tied with what looked like human hair, and arranged on flat stones were patterns made from animal bones, teeth, and what might have been very old coins or metal buttons. But what made my blood freeze was the presence of 6 other figures sitting around that fire pit. So still I had not initially registered them as human. They ranged in age from what might have been teenage to elderly, all wearing clothing that looked homemade from animal skins and plant fibers, all with that same too thin appearance and those same unnaturally steady gazes. One of them, an older woman with white hair down to her waist, stood up and spoke in a voice that carried elements of modern English mixed with speech patterns I did not recognize, welcoming us and thanking us for bringing Tyler back safely. I felt Marcus grab my arm, his grip tight enough to hurt, and I heard Jennifer make a small sound of distress behind me. Tyler walked over to the woman and stood beside her with obvious affection, and she placed her hand on his shoulder while explaining in that strange mixed dialect that the boy had been chosen, that they had been calling to him for months through his dreams, that he belonged with them now and would learn the old ways that kept the mountains alive. She said Tyler's family could go home, that they would not understand but would eventually accept, that this had been happening since long before the white settlers came and would continue happening long after we were gone. The other figures around the fire pit had not moved, had barely seemed to breathe, and I noticed for the first time that they were all watching us with expressions of patient curiosity, like scientists observing mice in a laboratory. Marcus was pulling at my arm, trying to get me to move back toward the path we had come through. But I found myself unable to look away from Tyler's face. The boy I saw sitting next to that woman was not frightened or coerced. He looked peaceful in a way that seemed fundamentally wrong, like something essential had been removed from him and replaced with something ancient and unrecognizable. The woman continued speaking, telling us that 7 others had joined them over the years, children and adults who had been reported missing and never found. People who had belonged to the mountains all along and had finally been called home. She gestured to the figures around the fire, and for the first time, they moved, each one shifting slightly to reveal items of clothing that I recognized from missing persons reports I had seen during my training. One of them, a teenager who could not have been more than 16, was wearing a very specific jacket, bright red with yellow piping, identical to the one described in a 1998 missing person case from this same general area. Another, a middle-aged man with a long beard, had on hiking boots with distinctive orange laces that matched a case from 2007. The woman with white hair noticed me staring and explained that time worked differently in the deep places, that those who had been with them longest sometimes forgot the years and sometimes remembered everything all at once, that eventually the memories of the outside world would fade completely and only the mountains would remain. She said this not as a threat, but as a simple statement of fact, and something in her tone made me believe she was describing not a kidnapping, but a transformation she genuinely thought was beneficial. Jennifer activated her emergency beacon, the one we carry for situations where immediate extraction is required, and the sharp electronic beep cut through the clearing like a gunshot. The woman tilted her head at the sound, and all of the figures around the fire stood up in perfect synchronization, moving with that same unnatural coordination. Marcus was no longer just pulling my arm, but physically dragging me backward, and I grabbed Tyler's wrist, intending to pull him with us. But the boy looked up at me with eyes that seemed far older than 8 years and said very calmly that I did not understand yet, but that I would. That I had been marked too. That the mountains chose certain people, and that once chosen, we could never truly leave. His wrist was ice cold under my grip, far colder than it should have been for someone who had been sitting next to a fire. And when I looked down, I saw symbols drawn on his skin in what looked like charcoal or ash. Patterns that seemed to move in my peripheral vision. The helicopter arrived 23 minutes later, its searchlight cutting through the canopy, and by the time the rescue crew reached our position, the clearing was empty except for the 4 of us. Tyler was unconscious, collapsed in Jennifer's arms with no memory of how he had gotten there. And the shelters and fire pit and bone arrangements had vanished like they had never existed. The ground showed no evidence of habitation, no compressed vegetation where structures had stood, no ash where the fire had been burning. Marcus and Jennifer and I gave identical reports describing what we had seen, and the incident commander listened with an expression that shifted from concern to skepticism to what looked like recognition, like he had heard similar stories before, but had not expected to hear them again. Tyler's family was relieved to have him back, and the boy had no conscious memory of the 8 hours he had been missing. But over the following weeks, his parents reported behavioral changes that prompted multiple sessions with child psychologists. Tyler would wake up speaking in rhythms that sounded like the language I had heard in that clearing. He drew pictures of people who matched the figures around the fire pit with impossible accuracy for a child who claimed no memory of them. He begged to go back to the mountains, became distressed when kept away from wooded areas, and eventually ran away from home 3 different times, always heading in the direction of Pisgah National Forest. I quit search and rescue after submitting my official report, which was filed in a category I had never seen before, marked as anomalous incident and restricted from public records requests. The incident commander told me privately that 6 other volunteers had encountered similar situations over the past 40 years, always in the same general area, always involving missing persons who were found in the presence of groups living in ways that should not have been possible. He showed me a file containing photographs from a 1952 case where my grandmother, who had disappeared during a church retreat in that same forest, appeared in the background of a park ranger's surveillance photo taken in 1999, looking exactly the same age as she had been when she vanished, standing among a group of figures at the edge of a clearing. I moved away from North Carolina the following spring, took a job in a city where the only trees are the ones planted in concrete boxes along sidewalks, where I am never more than 20 feet from other people in artificial light. But sometimes when I sleep, I dream I am back in that clearing, sitting by that fire, listening to songs in a language I should not understand, but somehow do. And sometimes when I wake up, there are symbols drawn on my arms in ash or charcoal, patterns that match the ones I saw on Tyler's wrist, marks that fade within minutes, but leave behind a coldness in my skin that lasts for hours. I tell myself they are just dreams, just psychological after effects of a traumatic experience. But I have stopped looking at maps of Appalachia, stopped reading about missing persons cases, stopped volunteering for anything that might require me to enter a forest, because I know with absolute certainty that if I go back into those mountains, I will not be searching anymore. I will be the one who needs to be found, and nobody will come looking because I will finally be exactly where I belong. Working on cell towers means you get used to heights, used to being alone 200 feet in the air with nothing but wind and sky. But I was never prepared for something watching me from above. I have been climbing towers for 11 years now. First, as an apprentice, learning the ropes from veterans who had been in the trade since the cellular boom of the 1990s. Then, as a certified technician, handling everything from routine maintenance to emergency repairs during storm season. The work pays well precisely because most people cannot handle the combination of physical danger, isolation, and the psychological weight of being suspended in the air for hours at a time. I never minded any of it. In fact, I preferred the solitude to the office jobs I had tried in my 20s. Preferred the simplicity of troubleshooting equipment problems to the complexity of navigating workplace politics. The assignment that changed everything came through in late August. A standard maintenance contract for a tower located deep in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. The tower serviced a remote section of the forest, where cell coverage was minimal at best. Used primarily by park rangers and the occasional backpacker who wandered far enough from civilization to need emergency communication capabilities. The site was accessible only by a deteriorating Forest Service road that required a 4-wheel drive vehicle and patience for the 2-hour drive from the nearest town. I had worked isolated locations before, but this one stood out for the sheer density of the surrounding forest. Trees so thick that the canopy created a permanent twilight at ground level, even at midday. The first 3 days went according to schedule. I arrived each morning around 8 a.m., climbed the tower to perform diagnostics and component replacements, ate my lunch at the top while reviewing work orders, and descended by 4 p.m. to make the drive back before dark. The tower itself was older than most I worked on. Installed in the early 2000s and showing signs of deferred maintenance that suggested I was the first technician to visit in several years. On the 4th day, as I was testing signal strength at the 180-foot platform, I heard something that made me pause with my hand frozen on the testing equipment. It was my own voice calling up from the forest below, speaking my name with perfect clarity, using the exact inflection my wife used when she was trying to get my attention from another room. I looked down through the metal grating of the platform, scanning the forest floor far below, seeing nothing but endless trees and shadows. I called out, asking if anyone was there, assuming perhaps a ranger had hiked in to check on my progress. But there was no response, except for my own voice echoing back from the tree line. Except the echo was wrong. It arrived half a second too late, and when I listened carefully, I realized it was not an echo at all, but a separate vocalization, mimicking my words, with a timing that suggested someone was repeating what I said rather than reflecting it. I finished my work quickly that afternoon and made a note in my log about possible acoustic anomalies caused by the terrain, convincing myself it was a natural phenomenon, even though I knew terrain echoes do not work that way. The voice appeared again the next day at exactly 4:47 p.m., just as I was preparing to descend for the evening. This time it was not calling my name, but speaking words I had only thought, never vocalized. It said my daughter's name, Madison, followed by a question about whether I had remembered to call her for her birthday, which was tomorrow, and which I had in fact forgotten about until that exact moment. My hands started shaking on the safety harness, and I had to force myself to breathe slowly and focus on the descent protocol. There was no possible way anyone could know about my daughter's birthday unless they had access to my personal information. And even then, they would not know that I had been worrying about forgetting it, because that thought had existed only inside my head. I started recording audio on my phone during my climbs, setting it to capture continuously throughout the workday. hoping to gather evidence that would either prove I was experiencing some explainable phenomenon or confirm that I was losing my grip on reality. The recordings revealed something far worse than either option. Every day at precisely 4:47 p.m., my voice appeared on the audio, speaking words I never said, discussing details about my life that I had never shared with anyone. It talked about my mother's illness, about financial problems I was hiding from my wife, about a mistake I had made at a previous job that I had never reported to my employer. The voice knew things that should have been locked inside my consciousness, and it spoke about them with a casual familiarity that made me feel violated in ways I could not adequately describe. On day 8 of the assignment, I decided to remain at the tower after 4:47 p.m., to wait and see if the voice would appear even if I altered my routine. I stayed on the platform as the sun set and the forest below darkened into an impenetrable mass of shadows. And at 4:47 exactly, the voice returned. But this time, instead of coming from below, it came from above, from somewhere beyond the top of the tower, in the empty air, where nothing should have been able to exist. I looked up through the steel framework and saw nothing. Just the darkening sky and the first stars beginning to appear. But I could hear it clearly. My own voice speaking from a position at least 50 feet above the highest point of the tower, telling me about a dream I had experienced the previous night, describing it in detail that I had not even fully remembered myself until hearing it spoken back to me. I started examining the tower more carefully during subsequent climbs, looking for any surveillance equipment or recording devices that might explain what was happening, even though I knew such an explanation was impossible. What I found instead were muddy handprints on the tower's steel beams, starting about 100 feet up and continuing to the very top, then over the top and down the opposite side. The prints were fresh, the mud still slightly damp, and they showed a hand with 6 distinct fingers, each one longer and thinner than human proportions should allow. I photographed the prints and measured them carefully, and when I compared them to my own hand, the scale was wrong, by a factor that suggested whatever had climbed that tower was significantly larger than any human being. I set up a trail camera pointing at the tower on day 10, positioning it to capture anyone or anything that might approach during the night. The footage I reviewed the next morning made me seriously consider abandoning the job without finishing the contract. The camera had captured something climbing the tower at 2:17 a.m., moving with a speed and fluidity that should not have been possible on the narrow steel beams. The figure was humanoid in basic shape, but wrong in every proportion. Limbs too long, joints bending at angles that violated human anatomy, moving up the 200-foot structure in less than 30 seconds. When it reached the top, it positioned itself directly above the highest platform and remained there, perfectly motionless, staring down at the ground where my equipment was staged for the next day's work. The most disturbing part of the footage came at 4:47 a.m., exactly 12 hours before the time when I consistently heard the voice. The figure opened its mouth, and even though the camera had no audio recording capability, I could see its jaw working, see its throat moving like it was speaking, and I knew with absolute certainty it was practicing my voice, rehearsing the words it would use later when I returned. I watched the entire 8-hour recording, and the figure never moved from its position above the tower, never descended, never showed any sign of discomfort or fatigue, despite being exposed to wind and weather in a position that would have been agonizing for any human to maintain for more than a few minutes. I did not return to the tower the next day. I called my supervisor and told him I was experiencing equipment failure and needed to abort the contract, which was a lie that would likely cost me the job. But I could not bring myself to climb that tower again, knowing something was waiting at the top. My supervisor was frustrated but agreed to send a different team to complete the work. And I drove home that same day, leaving thousands of dollars worth of equipment staged at the base of the tower because I was not willing to spend even 5 minutes at that site to retrieve it. Over the following weeks, I tried to forget about the experience, tried to convince myself I had been suffering from altitude-induced hallucinations or carbon monoxide exposure from my vehicle, or any of a dozen other rationale explanations. But the voice followed me home. It started appearing at random times, always at 4:47, morning or evening, speaking from locations where no one should have been present. I would hear it coming from my attic at 4:47 a.m., my own voice discussing things I had done that day before I had actually done them, predicting my choices with perfect accuracy. My wife asked if I was upstairs talking to myself, and I had no way to explain that the voice she was hearing was not coming from me, that something had learned to imitate me so perfectly that even the people who knew me best could not distinguish between the original and the copy. I developed a paranoia that consumed every waking moment, questioning whether I was actually myself or whether I might be the mimic, whether my memories were real or implanted, whether the life I remembered living was authentic or constructed. I would catch myself in mirrors and have moments of disorientation where I could not immediately recognize my own reflection, where I had to consciously verify that the person looking back at me was the same person I remembered being yesterday. My wife suggested therapy, and I went. But how do you explain to a mental health professional that you are afraid you might not be the original version of yourself? That something in the mountains had learned you so completely that it might have become you more accurately than you could maintain the role. The nightmares started around the same time. I would dream I was standing at the base of that tower, looking up at myself climbing the steel framework, watching my own form move through the maintenance routine with perfect technical precision. In the dreams, I was the one on the ground, the one watching, and the figure on the tower was the real me, the one who belonged up there in the sky, while I was the copy left behind to live out a borrowed life. I would wake up disoriented, unsure whether I had just been asleep or whether I had just been activated, whether the dream was the memory of my true existence and waking life was the fiction. I quit tower climbing entirely after 3 months of this psychological deterioration. Took a job doing inventory management for a telecommunications warehouse. Work that kept me at ground level and surrounded by other people at all times. I have not climbed anything taller than a stepladder in 8 months. Have not been alone for extended periods. Have not gone anywhere near the Monongahela National Forest. But I know the voice is still out there, still practicing, still perfecting its imitation. And I know with a certainty that feels like prophecy that eventually it will not need to hide in forests or at the tops of towers. Eventually, it will be ready to step into my life completely. And when it does, no one will be able to tell the difference, because it knows me better than I know myself, remembers my experiences more clearly than I do, understands my motivations and fears and desires with a depth that feels less like observation and more like ownership. Sometimes I wonder if that transition has already happened, if the thing I fear becoming is actually what I already am. And somewhere in the mountains, the original version of me is still climbing towers, still hearing voices, still trying to understand why he feels like a copy of someone else's life. My thesis was supposed to document disappearances in the Appalachian region between 1920 and 1950. But 8 months into my research, I started finding cases that technically should not exist. I was a graduate student at East Tennessee State University, working on my doctorate in Appalachian studies with a focus on historical migration patterns and unsolved missing person cases. The project began as straightforward archival work, combing through old newspaper records, police reports, and county death certificates to build a comprehensive database of unexplained disappearances during the early 20th century. I expected to find patterns related to economic hardship, mining accidents, or domestic situations that were improperly documented due to the remote nature of these communities. What I found instead was a pattern that made no demographic or chronological sense. A single individual appearing across multiple unrelated cases spanning 8 decades. The first anomaly appeared in a 1923 newspaper article from Harlan County, Kentucky, describing the disappearance of a coal miner named Robert Sullivan, who had last been seen walking toward the mine entrance on a Tuesday morning and simply never arrived. Witnesses reported seeing him talking to a woman near the tree line, a stranger with white blonde hair wearing a dark blue dress that several people noted seemed impractical for the rugged mountain terrain. The description was specific enough to be memorable, but vague enough that no one could provide additional identifying details. 3 weeks later, that same woman was reportedly seen in town wearing a man's coat that Robert's wife identified as belonging to her missing husband, based on a distinctive tear in the left sleeve that she had mended herself. I dismissed it initially as coincidence or misidentification, the kind of detail that gets exaggerated in small communities where everyone knows everyone else's business. But then I found a 1937 case from Swain County, North Carolina, involving a teenage girl named Eleanor Hutchins who disappeared during a church social. Multiple witnesses described her leaving with a woman who matched the identical description: white blonde hair, dark clothing, and an odd formality in her speech that people remembered because it seemed old-fashioned even for that time period. 2 months after Eleanor vanished, the same blonde woman was seen at a general store wearing a dress that Eleanor's mother swore was the one her daughter had been wearing the night she disappeared, right down to the hand-embroidered collar that had been Eleanor's own handiwork. As I expanded my research timeline into the 1940s, 1950s, and eventually into the modern era, the pattern became undeniable. Every decade contained at least 3 or 4 cases where this same woman appeared in witness statements, always in proximity to someone who would soon vanish, always later seen wearing clothing or accessories that belonged to the missing person. The descriptions never varied significantly, and in several cases where I could locate actual photographs taken at community events or family gatherings, I found images that appeared to show the same individual in the background. A woman at a 1931 county fair, standing behind a group of children, the same face visible in a 1968 photograph of a church congregation, an identical figure captured in a 1989 newspaper photo covering a town festival. I brought the photographs to a colleague in the university's digital forensics department, asking him to analyze them for any signs of manipulation or to determine if they might actually show different people who simply bore a strong resemblance to each other. His analysis took 3 weeks, and when he called me back to his lab, his expression told me the results were not what either of us had expected. The facial structure in all 7 photographs I had submitted was consistent within a margin that suggested the same person. Not just similar features, but identical bone structure, identical proportions, identical subtle asymmetries that are unique to each individual face. More disturbing was his observation that the woman in these photographs showed no signs of aging across a 58-year span, appearing to be approximately 30 years old in both the 1931 image and the 1989 image. I started interviewing elderly residents in the communities where disappearances had occurred, recording oral histories and asking specifically about the blonde woman without providing leading details. In Wise County, Virginia, I met an 87-year-old man named Thomas who remembered seeing that woman when he was a child in 1941. He described her with remarkable clarity, recalling how she had stood at the edge of a church picnic, watching but not participating, and how his mother had warned him to stay away from her because she collects people. When I asked what that meant, Thomas explained that his mother believed the woman took something essential from those she encountered, wore their clothes and mannerisms like costumes, and left them empty in ways that were worse than death. In Pocahontas County, West Virginia, I found a woman named Lorraine who claimed to have actually spoken with the blonde woman in 1976, shortly before Lorraine's sister disappeared during a camping trip. Lorraine described a conversation that still haunted her 45 years later, where the woman had asked detailed questions about Lorraine's sister, her habits, her way of speaking, her preferences and fears, all while maintaining intense eye contact that Lorraine remembered as deeply uncomfortable. The woman had explained that she was looking for herself in others, and that some people carried pieces that she needed to become complete. 3 days after that conversation, Lorraine's sister vanished during what should have been a well-marked trail hike, and her body was never recovered. The breakthrough in my research came when I found a connection between the disappearances and a specific geographic pattern. Every case occurred within a 15-mile radius of a particular valley system that stretched across the Tennessee-North Carolina border, an area so remote that modern development had barely touched it. Historical records showed that the valley had been inhabited by Cherokee communities before forced removal in the 1830s, and local folklore contained references to a spirit called the Collector, who wore the faces of the dead and walked among the living to learn what it meant to be human. The Cherokee stories described the Collector as something that had existed in the mountains since before human memory, something that was not evil, but not human either, endlessly trying to understand identity by borrowing it from others. I should have stopped there. Should have written up my findings as an interesting intersection of folklore and missing person cases. Should have stayed safely in the realm of academic analysis. Instead, I decided I needed to visit the valley myself, to see the geographic center of these disappearances, to document the actual locations rather than just studying them through historical records. I drove into the valley on a Thursday morning in September, following logging roads that were barely maintained and hiking the final 3 miles on trails that did not appear on any map. The valley was exactly as remote as the record suggested, a bowl-shaped depression surrounded by steep ridges, with a small creek running through the center and evidence of old homesteads long since reclaimed by forest. I was photographing one of the collapsed cabin foundations when I saw her standing approximately 40 yards away, watching me with patient curiosity. The woman from all those photographs and witness descriptions, unchanged, ageless, wearing clothes that looked like they had been assembled from different time periods, a blouse from one decade, pants from another, shoes that might have been modern or might have been vintage. My rational mind tried to explain her presence as coincidence, perhaps a local woman who happened to match the description. But something instinctive and primal in my nervous system knew immediately that I was looking at something that should not exist. She walked toward me with movements that seemed too fluid, too deliberate. And when she spoke, her voice had a quality that reminded me of someone learning a language from recordings, technically correct but missing some essential element of natural speech. She said she had been waiting for me, that she had seen me in town asking questions, that she knew I was trying to understand her. She asked if I wanted to know the truth about the disappearances. And despite every survival instinct screaming at me to run, I found myself agreeing, found myself following her deeper into the valley, toward a location she described as her home. The cave system she led me to was extensive, branching off into darkness beyond the reach of my flashlight, and the main chamber had been arranged with items that spanned more than a century. Clothing hung from makeshift racks, organized by decade. Personal effects were sorted into boxes labeled with years. Photographs covered one entire wall, hundreds of faces staring out at me. And I recognized several of them from my research into missing person cases. The woman explained in that strange, formal voice that she did not remember who she had been originally. That her first memories were of waking in these mountains with no identity, no past, no understanding of what she was supposed to be. She had learned that by taking pieces from others, by wearing their clothes and studying their photographs and learning their habits, she could build a sense of self that felt almost complete. She told me she had been doing this for longer than she could accurately remember, that time worked differently for her, that she experienced years and decades as humans might experience days and weeks. She described the process of selection, how she chose people who seemed to have strong identities, people who knew who they were with confidence, because those were the ones whose pieces fit together most coherently. She did not kill them, she insisted, but rather absorbed what made them themselves, leaving behind bodies that continued to function biologically, but were emptied of whatever spark made them individuals. Those empty shells wandered away into the deep forest and became the feral people that hikers sometimes reported seeing. Humans in appearance, but hollow in every way that mattered. She asked if I understood now, if my research had brought me the answers I was seeking. And then she said something that made my blood freeze in my veins. She told me I had the strongest sense of self she had encountered in years, that my dedication to understanding her story meant I had defined myself through this research more thoroughly than most people ever define themselves through anything. And that made me perfect for her collection. She reached toward me, and I finally broke through the paralysis that had been holding me in place, turned, and ran back through that cave system in complete darkness, bouncing off walls and falling over rocks, hearing her footsteps behind me matching my pace exactly, never rushing but never falling behind. I made it back to my car and drove for 6 hours straight without stopping, crossing state lines twice before I felt safe enough to check into a motel. I abandoned my thesis research completely, switched my academic focus to something completely unrelated to Appalachian studies, and moved to a city where mountains were not even visible on the horizon. But I know now that I am part of her pattern, part of her collection, because she found what she was looking for in me. And that kind of attention does not simply fade because you change geographic locations. I started finding items in my apartment that do not belong to me, clothing that appeared in my closet overnight, photographs in my drawers showing me in locations I have never visited, wearing expressions that do not match my memories. I catch glimpses of that woman in crowds, always at a distance, always watching. And I have developed the horrible suspicion that she is studying me, learning my patterns, preparing to wear me like she has worn so many others. Worse, I have started losing time, experiencing hours that I cannot account for, finding evidence of activities I did not perform. And I wonder with increasing frequency whether I am still the original version of myself, or whether the transition has already begun, whether my consciousness is the real one, or just the echo she left behind while she walked away, wearing everything that made me who I was. 10 years tracking black bear populations across the Smokies meant I knew their patterns, their territories, their behaviors, which is exactly why I noticed when something was mimicking them perfectly. I had completed my doctorate in wildlife ecology in 2012, and immediately took a position with the National Park Service studying black bear movements and human-wildlife interactions in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. The work involved extensive fieldwork, GPS collar monitoring, scat analysis, and behavioral observation that required spending weeks at a time in remote sections of the park where tourist traffic was minimal or non-existent. By 2022, I had personally tagged and tracked 47 individual bears, documented countless more through camera traps, and published multiple papers on bear behavior that were considered definitive references in my field. I understood these animals as well as any human could, which is why what I witnessed during the fall monitoring season of last year violated everything I knew about mammalian biology. The anomaly first appeared in data from a male bear I had designated as Bear 23, a 380-pound individual who had been collared 3 years earlier and whose movements I had been tracking with consistent reliability throughout that period. Bear 23 maintained a home range of approximately 18 square miles, followed predictable seasonal patterns, and exhibited behavior that was entirely typical for a dominant male in that region. In mid-October, his GPS collar started showing movement patterns that made no sense given what I knew about his habits and the physical limitations of bear anatomy. The collar indicated he had entered a rocky crevice system that I had personally surveyed the previous summer. A series of narrow passages between boulders with openings that measured no more than 24 inches across at their widest point. A bear of his size could not possibly fit through those openings, yet the GPS coordinates placed him deep within that system, more than 60 feet from any entrance large enough to accommodate his body mass. I hiked to the location the following day, expecting to find either equipment malfunction or evidence that the collar had somehow detached and been carried into the crevices by a smaller animal. What I discovered instead made me question my understanding of what was actually wearing that GPS device. The collar was still transmitting from inside the rock system, the signal strength and angle indicating it was approximately 15 feet below ground level. But when I examined the openings with high-powered lights and inspection cameras, I saw nothing. No bear, no collar, no sign of animal presence beyond some fur caught on the rocks that DNA analysis later confirmed belonged to Bear 23. I filed a report noting possible collar malfunction and planned to capture and re-collar the bear when he emerged from wherever he was actually located. 3 days later, one of my trail cameras captured an image that I initially dismissed as corruption or double exposure, but later realized showed something fundamentally wrong. The photograph, taken at 4:37 a.m. in an area where Bear 23 was known to forage, showed what appeared to be a black bear walking upright on its hind legs, maintaining that bipedal posture for the entire sequence of images spanning approximately 40 seconds. Bears can rear up briefly to investigate scents or threats, but sustained bipedal walking is not part of their natural movement vocabulary, particularly not with the smooth, deliberate gait pattern visible in these images. The bear in the photographs was wearing Bear 23's GPS collar, but its proportions seemed slightly wrong. Limbs perhaps a bit too long, posture too erect, head positioned at an angle that suggested a skeletal structure more adapted to upright movement than any bear should possess. I increased my camera density in that area, deploying 12 additional units to capture more detailed movement patterns. And the resulting footage over the following weeks showed behavior that became progressively more disturbing. The bear wearing Bear 23's collar was observed systematically investigating human campsites with a methodical precision that suggested intelligence beyond normal bear curiosity. It would approach sites when no humans were present, examine picnic tables and food storage containers without attempting to access the food itself, and spend extended periods appearing to study the layout of camping equipment, as if learning how these items were used. In one particularly unsettling sequence, The bear was captured picking up a camping chair, attempting to position it upright, and then lowering itself into a sitting position that looked like an attempt to mimic human posture, though its anatomy made the position awkward and unstable. On November 8th, I set up a nighttime observation post overlooking a meadow where Bear 23 had been consistently appearing at roughly the same time each evening. I was positioned approximately 200 yards away with night vision equipment and a spotting scope, recording video and taking detailed behavioral notes. The bear emerged from the tree line at 9:23 p.m., moving on all fours in typical bear fashion. But when it reached the center of the meadow and apparently believed itself unobserved, it stopped and stood upright. What happened next made my hands shake so badly I nearly dropped my recording equipment. The bear reached up with both front paws and appeared to grasp the fur and skin around its neck and head. And then it pulled, peeling the entire bear exterior away, like someone removing a costume. Underneath what I had believed was a bear was something that resembled an emaciated human form, though with proportions and articulation that were wrong in ways I struggled to process even as I watched it through the scope. The limbs were too long, the joints bent at angles that suggested additional articulation points beyond normal human anatomy, and the skin had a grayish pallor that looked almost stone-like in the green glow of my night vision device. The torso was covered in what appeared to be old scarring or tattooing, patterns of lines and symbols that covered most of the visible skin surface. The creature stood there in the open air for approximately 3 minutes, apparently stretching or performing some kind of movement routine. And I could see now that the bear skin was exactly that. An actual bear pelt that had been modified with internal supports to allow it to be worn as a fully mobile disguise. The creature picked up the bear skin, examined it with what looked like satisfaction, and then carefully put it back on, working its limbs back into the appropriate positions, adjusting the headpiece until it settled correctly. And within moments, it was once again moving exactly like a bear, indistinguishable from any other black bear in the forest. I continued recording until the bear left the meadow, and then I remained at my observation post until dawn, too shaken to trust myself to navigate the trail system in the dark. The implications of what I had witnessed were destroying my ability to think rationally. If something was wearing Bear 23 like a costume, what had happened to the actual bear? How long had this substitution been occurring? Were there others? Was every bear I had been tracking actually a bear? Or had my entire career been spent studying something else entirely? I returned to my office and began systematic review of all trail camera footage from the past 2 years, specifically looking for anomalies in bear behavior that I might have previously dismissed as unusual, but still within the range of normal variation. What I found suggested the problem was far more extensive than a single individual. I identified at least 6 instances across 4 different monitored bears where camera sequences showed behaviors that were inconsistent with ursine capabilities. Bears examining human tools with what appeared to be understanding rather than curiosity. Bears moving with coordination patterns that suggested practice rather than instinct. And in 3 separate instances, I found brief frames where the camera had captured what looked like a hand rather than a paw, visible for only a single frame before being withdrawn back into the bear exterior, so quick that I had to slow the footage to quarter speed to confirm what I was seeing. I compiled everything into a comprehensive report with full video documentation and submitted it through official channels to my supervisor and the park research director. Their response came within 48 hours, far faster than the typical weeks-long review process for research findings. I was called into a meeting with the research director and 2 individuals who identified themselves as being from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. though their credentials seemed oddly vague and their questions focused more on who I had spoken to about my findings than on the scientific implications of what I had documented. They informed me that my research methodology had been compromised by equipment malfunction, and that the phenomena I had reported were the result of camera artifacts and misinterpretation of normal bear behavior. When I objected and offered to demonstrate the clear evidence of what I had witnessed, they became less collegial and more directive, explaining that my grant funding was being discontinued due to budget restructuring, and that my position with the Park Service was being eliminated as part of a reduction in force. Within 1 week, I had been completely removed from my research projects. My access to park monitoring systems was revoked, and all of my camera equipment and data storage devices were confiscated for what they described as routine inventory audit. The official report filed regarding my findings stated that I had experienced altitude-related perceptual distortion and had misinterpreted standard wildlife behavior due to excessive time spent in isolated field conditions. My published papers remained in circulation, but any reference to my name in future Park Service documentation was quietly scrubbed from planning documents and researcher rosters. I received an offer of continued employment in a laboratory position that involved data entry and sample processing with no field work component, which I understood was meant to keep me employed and therefore subject to various confidentiality agreements while ensuring I would never return to the field. 2 weeks after my last day at the park office, I received an unmarked manila envelope delivered to my home address with no return information. Inside were photographs that I immediately recognized as having been taken from my own confiscated trail cameras, images that had never been included in my official reports because I had not yet processed that particular batch of memory cards before they were seized. The photographs showed multiple bears gathered in a clearing I recognized from my research area. At least 9 individuals in a configuration that was completely inconsistent with bear social behavior. Black bears are largely solitary outside of mating season and mother-cub groups. But these 9 bears were arranged in what looked like a deliberate circle, all facing inward toward a central point. And in the center of that circle was a pile of items that made my chest tighten with fear. GPS collars, at least 15 of them, stacked carefully on a flat rock like an offering or a message. The final photograph in the envelope showed a close-up view of one of the bears, and visible at the neck where the fur met the collar was a clear gap, a space where the bear's skin had pulled back slightly to reveal something underneath that was not animal tissue, but rather that same grayish, human-like skin I had seen through my spotting scope. Clipped to the photograph was a handwritten note on official Fish and Wildlife Service letterhead that read simply, "Sometimes bears are just bears. Maintain this understanding for your own safety and for the safety of your family." I accepted the laboratory position and have spent the past 8 months processing genetic samples and entering data into spreadsheets, never questioning inconsistencies in the results, never asking why certain DNA analyses produce outcomes that do not match any known species in the reference databases. I see my former colleagues occasionally, and they mention casually that bear behavior in the park has been exceptionally normal this year, that the monitoring programs are producing exactly the data they expected, that there have been no unusual incidents requiring investigation. I smile and agree, and do not mention that I have stopped taking my children camping, have stopped hiking in any forest, have developed an irrational fear of wildlife documentaries because I catch myself examining every animal on screen, looking for signs that it might be something else. Something that learned to be a bear so perfectly that it became indistinguishable from the real thing. Sometimes at night, I dream I am back in the field, watching through my spotting scope as the bear removes its skin. Except in the dream when the creature looks toward my observation post, I realize it has my face, my features, And I understand that somewhere in those mountains, there might be something wearing my skin the way it wore Bear 23's skin. Living my life more accurately than I ever could because it studied me with the same dedication I once studied Bear's. I wake up uncertain whether I am the one who escaped or the one who got left behind, whether the thing I fear becoming is actually what I already am. And I have learned to live with that uncertainty the same way I learned to stop questioning why some research findings are better left unpublished and some truths are safer left unconfirmed. Caring for dying patients in remote Appalachian hollers means you hear a lot of confessions, a lot of regrets. But what Mrs. Crawford told me in her final hours was not a confession. It was a warning. I had been working as a hospice nurse for 7 years when I took the assignment in late September, providing end-of-life care for an 89-year-old woman living in an isolated cabin about 12 miles outside of Unicoi, Tennessee. The property was accessible only by a rutted dirt road that required careful navigation even in dry weather. And the cabin itself sat at the end of a long hollow surrounded by dense forest that made the approach feel like traveling backward through time. Mrs. Crawford had no living family, no close friends willing to make the difficult journey to visit her. And according to my supervisor, she had specifically requested hospice care only after her condition had deteriorated to the point where she could no longer manage basic daily activities on her own. The first week was routine in the way that end-stage cancer care can be routine. Managing pain medication, assisting with hygiene, providing companionship to someone facing their final days with as much dignity as circumstances allowed. Mrs. Crawford was lucid most of the time, grateful for my presence, and surprisingly peaceful given her situation. She talked about her late husband, Thomas, about the life they had built in that hollow over 60 years of marriage, about the satisfaction of self-sufficiency and the beauty of isolation. But as her condition worsened and the morphine doses increased to manage her pain, her conversation shifted to topics that made me increasingly uncomfortable. She started apologizing to someone named Sarah, speaking to empty corners of the room as if someone was standing there listening, begging forgiveness for things she refused to explain when I gently asked who Sarah was. By the second week, Mrs. Crawford's lucid periods were shorter and more confused, and she began talking obsessively about the ones in the root cellar, returning to that phrase repeatedly with growing agitation. She would wake from sleep calling out warnings about keeping the cellar locked, about making sure no one went down there, about promises that had to be kept even after she was gone. I assumed this was morphine-induced delirium, the kind of confused imagery that often emerges as patients approach death. Memories mixing with dreams, mixing with fears in ways that create narratives that feel urgently real to the dying person, but have no actual basis in present reality. I reassured her that everything was secure, that she was safe, and administered additional medication when the agitation became distressing. On day 11 of my assignment, while Mrs. Crawford was sleeping deeply under sedation, I decided to do some basic property maintenance, clearing leaves from the porch and checking the perimeter of the cabin for any issues that might need attention. That was when I discovered the root cellar behind the main structure, partially concealed by overgrown blackberry bushes and positioned at the base of a small rise in the terrain. The entrance was a heavy wooden door set at an angle into the hillside, secured with a modern padlock that looked incongruous against the weathered wood and rusted hinges. Something about finding that cellar after days of hearing Mrs. Crawford's agitated references to it made my skin prickle with unease, and I found myself trying the lock even though I had no legitimate reason to access a storage area on a dying woman's property. The lock opened. Either it had not been properly secured, or it was old enough that the mechanism had failed. But with minimal effort, The door swung outward on hinges that shrieked with rust. The smell that emerged was not the expected mustiness of an old root cellar, but something more complex and disturbing, earth and decay, and something else underneath that reminded me of old clothes that had been stored in damp conditions for decades. I used my phone's flashlight to illuminate the interior, expecting to see the normal contents of an Appalachian root cellar, shelves of canned goods, tools, perhaps some furniture that had been stored away from the weather. What I saw instead made me stand frozen in the entrance for several seconds while my brain struggled to process the scene. The cellar was larger than it should have been based on the external dimensions, extending back into the hillside at least 30 feet, with a ceiling height that suggested it had been deliberately excavated rather than naturally formed. The walls were lined with items that clearly had belonged to children, arranged on crude shelves with an organizational system that suggested careful curation over an extended period. Clothing in various sizes, spanning what looked like decades of styles, from simple handmade dresses that might have been from the 1950s to more modern items from the 1980s and 1990s. Toys that ranged from carved wooden dolls to plastic action figures. Shoes in sizes from toddler to adolescent, worn but not discarded, positioned neatly in rows like a museum display. And most disturbingly, photographs, dozens of them, showing children of various ages, none of whom were smiling, all of whom had the same hollow expression in their eyes that I had learned to recognize in my hospice work as the look of someone who had given up hope. I should have left immediately. Should have locked that door and called the sheriff and waited for someone in authority to investigate what was clearly evidence of something terrible. Instead, I found myself walking deeper into that cellar, examining the items more closely, trying to understand the scope of what I was seeing. The clothing showed evidence of heavy use and minimal care, mended repeatedly but never properly cleaned, stiff with accumulated dirt and sweat. The toys were handled smooth in places, the kind of wear pattern that comes from constant nervous touching rather than playful use. And in the back of the cellar, I found sleeping pallets arranged on the earthen floor, thin mattresses that were rotted through with moisture but still showed the impressions where bodies had regularly lain. When I emerged from the cellar, my hands were shaking badly enough that I had difficulty securing the padlock, and I returned to the cabin to find Mrs. Crawford awake and staring at me with an expression of terrible clarity that cut through the morphine haze like she had been waiting for this exact moment. She knew where I had been without me saying a word, and she started talking before I could formulate the questions that were racing through my mind. She told me she and Thomas had taken in children over a 40-year period, children nobody would miss, runaways and orphans, and kids from situations so bad that disappearing into the mountains seemed preferable to staying where they were. They had not provided sanctuary, she explained in a voice that was flat and emotionless. They had provided labor, keeping the children in that cellar, bringing them out to work the property, feeding them minimally, teaching them to be useful and quiet and invisible. She said some of the children had eventually been released when they got old enough to be more trouble than they were worth, sent back into the world with threats about what would happen if they ever told anyone what had occurred in that hollow. But others, she admitted, had tried to escape before Thomas was ready to release them, had run into the forest without supplies or preparation, and she believed they were still out there, living wild in the deep woods, because children who grow up underground and isolated do not develop the skills needed to return to civilization. She said this not with guilt, but with a kind of practical assessment, like she was describing a failed agricultural experiment rather than decades of systematic abuse and imprisonment of vulnerable children. I asked why she was telling me this. Why now? And Mrs. Crawford said she needed someone to know the truth before she died, because the ones who escaped had been watching the cabin for years, waiting for her and Thomas to be vulnerable. Thomas had died 3 years earlier of a heart attack. And since then, she had been seeing figures at the edge of the tree line, always at dusk, always watching but never approaching. She believed they remembered who had helped them and who had hurt them, and they were trying to decide which category I fell into based on how I treated her in her final days. She said they left signs sometimes, animal bones arranged in patterns around the property, marks carved into trees that surrounded the cabin, and she implied that my safety depended on their judgment of my character. I reported everything to the sheriff's department the following day, providing detailed photographs and documentation of the cellar contents. The investigation took 3 weeks, including excavation of the surrounding property looking for remains. But they found nothing except evidence of long-term habitation by multiple people and items that matched missing person reports going back to 1958. The children in the photographs were never identified despite extensive efforts, and the case remained open but inactive for lack of physical evidence that would support criminal charges against a woman who died before the investigation could be completed. Mrs. Crawford passed away quietly 4 days after our conversation about the cellar, and I was present when it happened, holding her hand despite my revulsion at what she had confessed, because even monsters deserve to die with someone present. The letters started arriving at my home address approximately 2 weeks after Mrs. Crawford's death, delivered through regular mail with no return address and postmarked from various small towns throughout eastern Tennessee and western North Carolina. The handwriting looked like it had been done by someone who learned to write but never practiced regularly. Letters formed correctly, but with uncertain pressure and spacing. The content was simple. Just questions asking whether I was one of the kind ones, whether I had helped or hurt, whether I could be trusted. I never responded because I had no idea where to send a response. But the letters continued arriving every few days, and the questions became more specific, referencing details about my work that should not have been accessible to anyone except my patients and immediate family. I started seeing the figures Mrs. Crawford had described, always at dusk, always at a distance where details were impossible to make out clearly. They appeared outside the homes of my hospice patients, standing at the edges of properties, watching me arrive and depart. I would see them when I stopped for gas in rural areas, positioned in the tree line beyond the station, motionless for extended periods. And most disturbingly, I began seeing them outside my own home, figures that maintained the same distance and never approached, but were clearly following some kind of pattern, appearing on a schedule that suggested coordination and planning rather than random occurrence. The figures were always elderly, or nearly so, stooped and weathered in ways that suggested lives lived entirely outdoors. And they moved with a hesitance that reminded me of the body language of severely traumatized patients I had worked with in psychiatric facilities early in my career. They never threatened, never approached closer than about 50 yards, but their presence was a constant weight on my consciousness, and I found myself changing my routines, avoiding certain routes, checking my surroundings obsessively in ways that made my family ask if something was wrong. One of them left a note on my car windshield while I was inside a patient's home, written in that same uncertain hand. We remember who helped and who did not. We are deciding which you are. I transferred to urban hospice work 6 months ago, taking a significant pay cut to work exclusively in hospital settings and nursing facilities, where I am never alone with patients, never in isolated locations, never required to travel to remote properties. But the letters still arrive periodically, always asking the same questions about kindness and trust. And I have started recognizing the same elderly figures in the backgrounds of news footage from Appalachian communities, standing at the edges of crowds during community events, positioned in ways that suggest they are searching for something or someone specific. I wake up some nights convinced that they have made their decision about me and that I will find them waiting outside my apartment. But so far they remain distant, watching, evaluating. And I live with the knowledge that somewhere in those mountains are people who were children when Mrs. Crawford and her husband taught them that humans were something to be feared and used. And they are still out there deciding what to do with that lesson now that they are old enough to act on it. Tracing family trees is usually boring work, birth certificates and census records, until I found a DNA match to someone who, according to every official document, died in 1897. I had been working as a professional genealogist for 6 years, helping clients trace their ancestry through a combination of genetic testing and historical record analysis. Most cases were straightforward, connecting living people to documented lineages through marriage certificates, immigration records, and property deeds that painted clear pictures of family movement across generations. I specialized in Appalachian families, particularly those whose roots extended back to pre-Civil War settlement patterns in the mountain regions of Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee. The work was methodical and satisfying, solving historical puzzles through careful documentation and cross-referencing multiple sources to verify accuracy. The case that destroyed my understanding of linear time began when I decided to research my own family history as part of a larger project documenting migration patterns from Harlan County, Kentucky. I submitted my DNA to 3 major ancestry databases and began the standard process of building my family tree backward through available records. My great-great-grandfather, Michael Adams, appeared in the 1920 census as a coal miner living in Harlan County with a wife and 3 children. Census records before that became spotty, but I eventually traced him back to an 1897 death certificate stating he had been killed in a mining accident at age 34. Buried in an unmarked grave in a cemetery that no longer existed after the land had been reclaimed for strip mining operations in the 1960s. The DNA results came back, showing the expected matches to distant cousins and third-degree relatives whose family trees I could verify through conventional research. But one match appeared that made no sense within the framework of documented history. The profile was labeled simply M.A. Unknown and showed a relationship consistent with a first or second cousin, indicating we shared a recent common ancestor within the past 2 or 3 generations. The genetic relationship was too close to be explained by descent from Michael Adams' siblings, none of whom had children who would produce this level of DNA overlap. I sent multiple messages through the Ancestry platform asking M.A. Unknown to provide additional information about their family background. But the account never responded to contact attempts despite showing regular login activity. I became obsessed with solving this particular mystery, convinced that there must be some documentation error in my research or some family secret that would explain the impossible genetic connection. I traveled to Harlan County and spent 2 weeks in local historical archives, examining every available record that might reference Michael Adams or his immediate family. What I found instead were anomalies that suggested my great-great-grandfather's story was more complicated than a simple death in 1897. A newspaper article from 1927 mentioned a Michael Adams who had disappeared during a particularly violent coal strike, described as being in his early 40s, which would be roughly correct if he had somehow survived the 1897 mining accident. I dismissed it as coincidence initially, Adams being a common surname in that region. But the physical description in the article matched details from earlier records with unsettling precision. The local historical society had a photograph collection that included images from various community events spanning decades. And while examining a box of photos from a 1968 bluegrass festival, I found an image that made my hands start shaking. In the background of a crowd shot, clearly visible despite being slightly out of focus, was a man who was identical to the 1890s photograph of Michael Adams I had found in family documents. Same facial structure, same distinctive scar on his left cheek that family letters had mentioned he received as a teenager. Same unusual ear shape that was distinctive enough to be unmistakable. The man in the 1968 photograph appeared to be in his 30s or early 40s, exactly the same age as he had been in the 1890s image taken 70 years earlier. I found additional photographs spanning multiple decades showing what appeared to be the same individual. A 1985 image from a church potluck, a 2003 picture from a county fair, a 2011 photograph from a historical preservation event. In each image, the man appeared to be roughly the same age, showing no signs of the normal progression of time that should have left him elderly or dead by the later photographs. I brought these images to a forensic photographer who specialized in age progression analysis, asking her to evaluate whether these could possibly be the same person across such an extended time frame. Her analysis confirmed that the facial bone structure was consistent across all images, with variations that fell within the normal range of weight fluctuation and expression changes, rather than the fundamental structural alterations that accompany aging. I decided the only way to understand what was happening was to visit the original homestead where Michael Adams had lived. A property that was still accessible, though the structures had long since collapsed. I drove to the location on a cold October morning and hiked the final half-mile through overgrown forest to reach what remained of the foundation stones. I had brought copies of the photographs and my research notes, thinking perhaps being at the actual site might help me see some connection I'd been missing. I was examining the foundation and trying to imagine the layout of the original cabin when I heard someone approaching through the trees behind me. The man who emerged from the forest was the same man from all the photographs. And when he saw me, he stopped with an expression of recognition that suggested he had been expecting this encounter. He spoke first, asking if I was Adams' family based on the resemblance. And when I confirmed that Michael Adams was my great-great-grandfather, he nodded slowly and said that explained why I had been able to find him. He introduced himself as Michael, offered no last name, and explained that he had been watching for family members who might come looking because blood calls to blood in ways that made conventional genealogical research complicated. He told me a story that sounded like folklore, but was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting routine biographical information. After the 1897 mining accident, he had fled into the deep mountains to hide from mine bosses who were targeting union organizers. He had gone far enough into the wilderness that he encountered places where the normal rules of time and space did not function consistently. He described it as finding pockets where decades passed differently, where you could live the same years repeatedly, where aging stopped or reversed depending on factors he still did not fully understand. Others had found these places too, he said. Dozens of people across the past century who had wandered too deep into the Appalachian wilderness and gotten stuck in temporal loops that made their relationship with chronological time highly unstable. He explained that he had tried to leave many times, had attempted to reintegrate into normal society during various decades, but each time he ventured back into conventional time streams, something pulled him back to the mountains. He would experience brief periods of normal life before finding himself drawn back to the same geographic locations, the same year ranges, living in a cycle that repeated with slight variations but never truly progressed forward. He said I was now part of that cycle too, that by finding him and understanding what he was, I had connected myself to the temporal distortion that had trapped him. The DNA match I had found was not from a living relative, but from someone who existed in multiple time periods simultaneously. And by pursuing that connection, I had anchored myself to the same pattern. I thought he was suffering from some kind of delusion until he showed me something that made rational denial impossible. He pulled out a photograph from his jacket pocket and handed it to me without comment. The image showed the 2003 Bluegrass Festival I had found in the Historical Society archives. But this version of the photograph was wider angle and showed more of the crowd. In the front row, clearly visible and in focus, was a child who was unmistakably me at approximately 6 years old, standing next to the adult version of Michael Adams. I have no memory of that festival, no memory of ever being in Harlan County as a child. And according to my own family records, I was living in Ohio in 2003 and had never visited Kentucky until I began this research project as an adult. Michael told me I would start experiencing the temporal anomalies soon, that I would lose time and find myself in places I did not remember traveling to, that I would discover evidence of my own presence in historical records that predate my birth. He said some people adapt to it, and some people break under the psychological strain of existing in multiple time streams simultaneously. And he suggested I stop researching family history, because every additional connection I made would strengthen the temporal anchoring and make it harder to maintain a coherent experience of linear time. He walked back into the forest without another word, and I returned to my car, feeling like I had been part of a surreal dream rather than an actual conversation. The first temporal discontinuity occurred 3 weeks later. I lost 6 hours on a Tuesday afternoon, finding myself standing in a parking lot in West Virginia with no memory of how I had gotten there or what I had been doing. My car's GPS showed I had driven 240 miles from my home, following a route that led to historical sites in Harlan County I had researched, but never physically visited. Over the following months, the episodes became more frequent and more disorienting. I would experience vivid memories of events that never occurred in my documented timeline, find photographs in my possession showing me at locations during time periods when I could prove I was elsewhere, and wake up with knowledge of historical events I had never studied but described with the accuracy of someone who had witnessed them firsthand. The most disturbing discovery came when I found myself compulsively searching historical archives for my own name, and found it appearing in records that predated my birth by decades. A 1978 property deed in Harlan County showed my signature as a witness. A 1989 newspaper article about a local festival included my name in the list of attendees. A 2001 census record from a remote mountain community listed me as a resident despite the fact that I was in college in Ohio during that year. Each time I found these historical references to my own impossible presence, I felt my grip on linear identity loosening, questioned whether my memories of a normal childhood and conventional timeline were authentic or constructed, whether I was the original version of myself or some temporal echo that had gained consciousness without realizing it was a copy of someone else. I have stopped researching family history entirely, changed careers to something completely unrelated to genealogy or historical analysis, and moved to a city where mountains are not visible and historical records are stored in digital formats I can avoid. But I know the temporal distortion is still affecting me because I keep finding evidence of myself in times and places I should not exist. And I have recurring dreams where I am standing in those deep Appalachian hollers, watching multiple versions of myself at different ages, all occupying the same space simultaneously. And I cannot determine which one is the original and which ones are the echoes. And perhaps that distinction stopped meaning anything the moment I traced my family tree back far enough to find the place where linear time breaks down and blood calls to blood across decades that exist in loops rather than lines.